This is section 93 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 93, The Real Colonel Sellers, Golden Days. There are bound to be vexations, flies in the ointment, as we say. It was Warner who conferred the name of Eschol Sellers on the chief figure of the collaborated novel. Warner had known it as the name of an obscure person, or perhaps he had only heard of it. At all events, it seemed a good one for the character and had been adopted. But behold, the book had been issued but a little while when there rose out of the vasty deeps a genuine Eschol Sellers, who was a very respectable person. He was a stout, prosperous-looking man, gray and about 55 years old. He came into the American Publishing Company offices and asked permission to look at the book. Mr. Bliss was out at the moment, but presently arrived. The visitor rose and introduced himself. "My name is Eschol Sellers," he said. "You have used it in one of your publications. It has brought upon me a lot of ridicule. My people wish me to sue you for $10,000 damages." He had documents to prove his identity, and there was only one thing to be done. He must be satisfied. Bliss agreed to recall as many of the offending volumes as possible and change the name on the plates. He contacted the authors, and the name Beriah was substituted for the offending Eschol. It turned out that the real Sellers family was a large one, and that the given name Eschol was not uncommon in its several branches. This particular Eschol Sellers, curiously enough, was an inventor and a promoter, though of a much more substantial sort than his fiction namesake. He was also a painter of considerable merit, a writer, and an antiquarian. He was said to have been a grandson of the famous painter Rembrandt Peale. Clemens vowed that he would not lecture in America that winter. The irrepressible Redpath besieged him as usual, and at the end of January Clemens telegraphed him, as he thought, finally. Following it with a letter of explanation, he added: "I said to her, 'There isn't money enough in America to hire me to leave you for one day.'" But Redpath was a persistent devil. He used arguments and held out inducements which even Mrs. Clemens thought should not be resisted, and Clemens yielded from time to time, and gave a lecture here and there during February. Finally, on the 3d of March, 1879, he telegraphed his tormentor: "Why don't you congratulate me? I never expect to stand on a lecture platform again after Thursday night." Howells tells delightfully of a visit which he and Aldrich paid to Hartford just at this period. Aldrich went to visit Clemens, and Howells to visit Charles Dudley Warner, Clemens coming as far as Springfield to welcome them. "In the good fellowship of that cordial neighborhood we had two such days as the aging sun no longer shines on in his round. There was constant running in and out of friendly houses where the living hosts and guests called one another by their Christian names or nicknames, and no such vain ceremony as knocking or ringing at doors. Clemens was then building the stately mansion in which he satisfied his love of magnificence as if it had been another sealskin coat, and he was at the crest of the prosperity which enabled him to humor every whim or extravagance." Howells tells how Clemens dilated on the advantages of subscription sale over the usual methods of publication, and urged the two Boston authors to prepare something which canvassers could handle. "Why, any other means of bringing out a book is privately printing it," he declared, and added that his subscription books in Bliss's hands sold right along, "just like the Bible." On the way back to Boston, Howells and Aldrich planned a subscription book which would sell straight along like the Bible. It was to be called "12 Memorable Murders." They had dreamed 2 or 3 fortunes by the time they had reached Boston, but the project ended there. "We never killed a single soul," Howells said once to the writer of this memoir. Clemens was always urging Howells to visit him after that. He offered all sorts of inducements. "You will find us the most reasonable people in the world. We had thought of precipitating upon you George Warner and his wife one day, Twichell and his jewel of a wife another day, and Charles Perkins and wife another. Only those, simply members of our family they are, but I'll close the door against them all, which will fix all of the lot except Twichell, who will no more hesitate to climb in the back window than nothing. And you shall go to bed when you please, get up when you please, talk when you please, read when you please." A little later he was urging Howells or Aldrich, or both of them, to come to Hartford to live. "Mr. Hall, who lives in the house next to Mrs. Stowe's, just where we drive in to go to our new house, will sell for 16,000 or 17,000. You can do your work just as well here as in Cambridge, can't you? Come, will one of you boys buy that house? Now say yes." Certainly those were golden, blessed days, and perhaps, as Howells said, the sun does not shine on their like any more, not in Hartford, at least, for the old group that made them no longer assembles there. Hartford about this time became a sort of shrine for all literary visitors, and for other notables as well, whether of America or from overseas. It was the halfway place between Boston and New York, and pilgrims going in either direction rested there. It is said that travelers arriving in America were apt to remember 2 things they wished to see: Niagara Falls and Mark Twain. But the Falls had no such recent advertising advantage as that spectacular success in London. Visitors were apt to begin in Hartford. Howells went with considerable frequency after that, or rather with regularity, twice a year or oftener, and his coming was always hailed with great rejoicing. They visited and ate around at one place and another among that pleasant circle of friends, but they were happiest afterward together, Clemens smoking continually, "soothing his tense nerves with a mild hot Scotch," says Howells, "while we both talked and talked and tasked of everything in the heavens and on the earth, and the waters under the earth. After 2 days of this talk I would come away hollow, realizing myself best in the image of one of those locust shells which you find sticking to the bark of trees at the end of summer." Sometimes Clemens told the story of his early life, "the inexhaustible, the fairy, the Arabian Nights story, which I could never tire of, even when it began to be told over again." End of Chapter 93. The Real Colonel Sellers, Golden Days, read by John Greenman. This is section 94 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 94. Beginning Tom Sawyer. The Clemens household went to Quarry Farm in April, leaving the new house once more in the hands of the architect and builders. It was costing a vast sum of money, and there was a financial stress upon the land. Mrs. Clemens, always prudent, became a little uneasy at times, though without warrant in those days, for her business statement showed that her holdings were only a little less than $250,000 in her own right, while her husband's books and lectures had been highly remunerative and would be more so. They were justified in living in ample, even luxurious comfort, and how free from financial worries they could have lived for the rest of their days. Clemens, realizing his happiness, wrote Dr. Brown: Indeed, I am thankful for the wifey and the child, and if there is one individual creature on all this footstool who is more thoroughly and uniformly and unceasingly happy than I am, I defy the world to produce him and prove him. In my opinion, he don't exist. I was a mighty rough, coarse, unpromising subject when Livy took charge of me 4 years ago, and I may still be to the rest of the world, but not to her. She has made a very creditable job of me. Truly, fortune not only smiled, but laughed. Every mail brought great bundles of letters that sang his praises. Robert Watt, who has translated his books into Danish, wrote of their wide popularity among his people. Madame Blanc, Teresa Benson, who as early as 1872 had translated The Jumping Frog into French, and published it, with extended comment on the author and his work, in the Revue des Deux Mondes, was said to be preparing a review of The Gilded Age. All the world seemed ready to do him honor. Of course, one must always pay the price, usually a vexatious one. Bores stopped him on the street to repeat ancient and witless stories. Invented anecdotes, some of them exasperating ones, went the rounds of the press. Impostors in distant localities personated him, or claimed to be near relatives, and obtained favors, sometimes money, in his name. Trivial letters seeking benefactions of every kind took the savor from his daily mail. Letters from literary aspirants were so numerous that he prepared a form letter of reply. Dear Sir or Madam, experience has not taught me very much, still it has taught me that it is not wise to criticize a piece of literature, except to an enemy of the person who wrote it. Then, if you praise it, that enemy admires you for your honest manliness, and if you dispraise it, he admires you for your sound judgment. Yours truly, S. L. C. Even Orion, now in Keokuk on a chicken farm, pursued him with manuscripts and proposals of schemes. Clemens had bought this farm for Orion, who had counted on large and quick returns, but was planning new enterprises before the first eggs were hatched. Orion Clemens was as delightful a character as was ever created in fiction, but he must have been a trial now and then to Mark Twain. We may gather something of this from a letter written by the latter to his mother and sister at this period. I can't encourage Orion. Nobody can do that conscientiously, for the reason that before one's letter has time to reach him he is off on some new wild goose chase. Would you encourage in literature a man who, the older he grows, the worse he writes? I cannot encourage him to try the ministry, because he would change his religion so fast that he would have to keep a traveling agent under wages to go ahead of him to engage pulpits and board for him. I cannot conscientiously encourage him to do anything but potter around his little farm and put in his odd hours contriving new and impossible projects at the rate of 365 a year, which is his customary average. He says he did well in Hannibal. Now, there is a man who ought to be entirely satisfied with the grandeurs, emoluments, and activities of a hen farm. If you ask me to pity Orion, I can do that. I can do it every day and all day long. But one can't encourage quicksilver, because the instant you put your finger on it, it isn't there. No, I am saying too much. He does stick to his literary and legal aspirations, and he naturally would elect the very two things which he is wholly and preposterously unfitted for. If I ever become able, I mean to put Orion on a regular pension without revealing the fact that it is a pension. He did presently allow the pension, a liberal one, which continued until neither Orion Clemens nor his wife had further earthly need of it. Mark Twain for some time had contemplated one of the books that will longest preserve his memory, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The success of Roughing It naturally made him cast about for other autobiographical material, and he remembered those days along the river front in Hannibal, his skylarking with Tom Blankenship, the Bowen boys, John Briggs, and the rest. He had recognized these things as material, inviting material it was, and now in the cool luxury of Quarry Farm he set himself to spin the fabric of youth. He found summer-time always his best period for literary effort, and on a hillside just by the old quarry Mrs. Crane had built for him that spring a study, a little room of windows somewhat suggestive of a pilot-house, overlooking the long sweep of grass and the dreamlike city below. Vines were planted that in the course of time would cover and embower it. There was a tiny fireplace for chilly days. To Twichell, of his new retreat, Clemens wrote: "It is the loveliest study you ever saw. It is octagonal, with a peaked roof, each face filled with a spacious window, and it sits perched in complete isolation on the top of an elevation that commands leagues of valley and city and retreating ranges of distant blue hills. It is a cozy nest, and just room in it for a sofa, table, and 3 or 4 chairs, and when the storms sweep down the remote valley and the lightning flashes behind the hills beyond, and the rain beats upon the roof over my head, imagine the luxury of it." He worked steadily there that summer. He would go up mornings after breakfast, remaining until nearly dinner time, say until 5 o'clock or after, for it was not his habit to eat luncheon. Other members of the family did not venture near the place, and if he was urgently wanted they blew a horn. Each evening he brought down his day's performance to read to the assembled family. He felt the need of audience and approval. Usually he earned the latter, but not always. Once, when for a day he put aside other matters to record a young undertaker's love affair, and brought down the result in the evening, fairly bubbling with the joy of it, he met with a surprise. The tale was a ghastly burlesque, its humor of the most disheartening, unsavory sort. No one spoke during the reading, nobody laughed. The air was thick with disapproval. His voice lagged and faltered toward the end. When he finished there was heavy silence. Mrs. Clemens was the only one who could speak. "Youth, let's walk a little," she said. The undertaker's love story is still among the manuscripts of that period, but it is unlikely that it will ever see the light of print. This tale bears no relation to the undertaker's story in Sketches New and Old. The Tom Sawyer tale progressed steadily and satisfactorily. Clemens wrote Dr. Brown: I have been writing 50 pages of manuscript a day, on an average, for some time now, on a book, a story, and consequently have been so wrapped up in it, and dead to everything else, that I have fallen mighty short in letter writing. On hot days I spread the study wide open, anchor my papers down with brickbats, and write in the midst of the hurricane, clothed in the same thin linen we make shirts of. He encloses some photographs in this letter. The group, he says, represents the vine-clad carriageway in front of the farmhouse. On the left is Megalopus, sitting in the lap of her German nursemaid. I am sitting behind them. Mrs. Crane is in the center, Mr. Crane next to her, then Mrs. Clemens and the new baby. Her Irish nurse stands at her back. Then comes the table waitress, a young negro girl born free. Next to her is Auntie Cord, a fragment of whose history I have just sent to a magazine. She is the cook, was in slavery more than 40 years, and the self-satisfied wench, the last of the group, is the little baby's American nursemaid. In the middle distance my mother-in-law's coachman, up on errand, has taken a position unsolicited to help out the picture. No, that is not true. He was waiting there a minute or two before the photographer came. In the extreme background, under the archway, you glimpse my study. The new baby, Bay, as they came to call her, was another little daughter born in June, a happy, healthy addition to the household. In a letter written to Twichell we get a sweet summer picture of this period, particularly of little sunny-haired 2-year-old Susie. There is nothing selfish about the Modoc. She is fascinated with the new baby. The Modoc rips and tears around outdoors most of the time, and consequently is as hard as a pine knot and as brown as an Indian. She is bosom friend to all the chickens, ducks, turkeys, and guinea hens on the place. Yesterday, as she marched along the winding path that leads up the hill through the red clover beds to the summer house, there was a long procession of these fowls stringing contentedly after her, led by a stately rooster who can look over the Modoc's head. The devotion of these vassals has been purchased with daily largesse of Indian meal, and so the Modoc, attended by her bodyguard, moves in state wherever she goes. There were days, mainly Sundays, when he did not work at all, peaceful days of lying fallow, dreaming in shady places, drowsily watching little Susie, or reading with Mrs. Clemens. Howells's Foregone Conclusion was running in the Atlantic that year, and they delighted in it. Clemens wrote the author: I should think that this must be the daintiest, truest, most admirable workmanship that was ever put on a story. The creatures of God do not act out their natures more unerringly than yours do. If your genuine stories can die, I wonder by what right old Walter Scott's artificialities shall continue to live. At other times he found comfort in the society of Theodore Crane. These two were always fond of each other, and often read together the books in which they were mutually interested. They had portable hammock arrangements, which they placed side by side on the lawn, and read and discussed through summer afternoons. The Mutineers of the Bounty was one of the books they liked best, and there was a story of an Iceland farmer, a human document that had an unfading interest. Also there were certain articles in old numbers of the Atlantic that they read and reread. Pepys' Diary, 2 Years Before the Mast, and a book on the Andes were reliable favorites. Mark Twain read not so many books, but read a few books often. Those named were among the literature he asked for each year of his return to Quarry Farm. Without them the farm and the summer would not be the same. Then there was Lecky's History of European Morals. There were periods when they read Lecky avidly and discussed it in original and unorthodox ways. Mark Twain found an echo of his own philosophies in Lecky. He made frequent marginal notes along the pages of the world's moral history, notes not always quotable in the family circle. Mainly, however, they were short, crisp interjections of assent or disapproval. In one place Lecky refers to those who have undertaken to prove that all our morality is a product of experience, holding that a desire to obtain happiness and to avoid pain is the only possible motive to action, the reason and the only reason why we should perform virtuous actions being that on the whole such a course will bring us the greatest amount of happiness. Clemens has endorsed these philosophies by writing on the margin, "Sound and true." It was the philosophy which he himself would always hold, though apparently never live by, and in the end would embody a volume of his own, "What is Man?" privately printed in 1906. In another place Lecky himself, speaking, says, "Fortunately we are all dependent for many of our pleasures on others. Cooperation and organization are essential to our happiness, and these are impossible without some restraint being placed upon our appetites. Laws are made to secure this restraint, and being sustained by rewards and punishments, they make it the interest of the individual to regard that of the community." "Correct," comments Clemens. "He has proceeded from unreasoned selfishness to reasoned selfishness. All our acts, reasoned and unreasoned, are selfish." It was a conclusion he logically never departed from. Not the happiest one, it would seem, at first glance, but one easier to deny than to disprove. On the back of an old envelope Mark Twain set down his literary declarations of this period: "I like history, biography, travels, curious facts and strange happenings, and science, and I detest novels, poetry, and theology." But of course the novels of Howells would be excepted. Lecky was not theology, but the history of it. His taste for poetry would develop later, though it would never become a fixed quantity, as was his devotion to history and science. His interest in these amounted to a passion. End of Chapter 94. Beginning Tom Sawyer. Read by John Greenman. This is section 95 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 95. An Atlantic Story and a Play. The reference to Auntie Cord in the letter to Dr. Brown brings us to Mark Twain's first contribution to the Atlantic Monthly. Howells, in his recollections of his Atlantic editorship, after referring to certain Western contributors, says: "Later came Mark Twain, originally of Missouri, but then provisionally of Hartford, and now ultimately of the solar system, not to say the universe. He came first with A True Story, one of those noble pieces of humanity with which the South has atoned chiefly, if not solely, through him for all its despite to the negro." Clemens had long aspired to appear in the Atlantic, but such was his own rating of his literature that he hardly hoped to qualify for its pages. Twichell remembers his "mingled astonishment and triumph" when he was invited to send something to the magazine. He was obliged to send something once or twice before the acceptance of A True Story, the narrative of Auntie Cord, and even this acceptance brought with it the return of a fable which had accompanied it, with the explanation that a fable like that would disqualify the magazine for every denominational reader, though Howells hastened to express his own joy in it, having been particularly touched by the author's reference to Sisyphus and Atlas as ancestors of the tumblebug. The True Story, he said, with its realist king of black talk, won him, and a few days later he wrote again: "This little story delights me more and more. I wish you had about 40 of 'em." And so, modestly enough, as became him, for the story was of the simplest, most unpretentious sort, Mark Twain entered into the school of the elect. In his letter to Howells, accompanying the manuscript, the author said: "I enclose also A True Story, which has no humor in it. You can pay as lightly as you choose for that if you want it, for it is rather out of my line. I have not altered the old colored woman's story except to begin it at the beginning instead of the middle, as she did, and traveled both ways." Howells, in his recollections, tells of the business anxiety in the Atlantic office in the effort to estimate the story's pecuniary value. Clemens and Hart had raised literary rates enormously. The latter was reputed to have received as much as 5 cents a word from affluent newspapers. But the Atlantic was poor, and when $60 was finally decided upon for the 3 pages, about 2½ cents a word, the rate was regarded as handsome, without precedent in Atlantic history. Howells adds that as much as 40 times this amount was sometimes offered to Mark Twain in later years. Even in '74 he had received a much higher rate than that offered by the Atlantic, but no acceptance, then or later, ever made him happier, or seemed more richly rewarded. "A True Story, repeated word for word as I heard it," was precisely what it claimed to be. Atlantic Monthly for November, 1874, also included in Sketches New and Old. Auntie Cord, the Auntie Rachel of that tale, cook at Quarry Farm, was a Virginia negress who had been twice sold as a slave, and was proud of the fact, particularly proud that she had brought $1,000 on the block. All her children had been sold away from her, but it was a long time ago, and now at 60 she was fat and seemingly without care. She had told her story to Mrs. Crane, who had more than once tried to persuade her to tell it to Clemens, but Auntie Cord was reluctant. One evening, however, when the family sat on the front veranda in the moonlight, looking down on the picture city, as was their habit, Auntie Cord came around to say good night, and Clemens engaged her in conversation. He led up to her story, and almost before she knew it she was seated at his feet, telling the strange tale in almost the exact words in which it was set down by him next morning. It gave Mark Twain a chance to exercise two of his chief gifts, transcription and portrayal. He was always greater at these things than at invention. Auntie Cord's story is a little masterpiece. He wished to do more with Auntie Cord and her associates of the farm, for they were extraordinarily interesting. Two other negroes on the place, John Lewis and his wife we shall hear notably of Lewis later were not always on terms of amity with Auntie Cord. They disagreed on religion, and there were frequent battles in the kitchen. These depressed the mistress of the house, but they gave only joy to Mark Twain. His Southern raising had given him an understanding of their humor, their native emotions, which made these riots a spiritual gratification. He would slip around among the shrubbery and listen to the noise and strife of battle, and hug himself with delight. Sometimes they resorted to missiles, stones, tinware, even dressed poultry which Auntie Cord was preparing for the oven. Lewis was very black. Auntie Cord was a bright mulatto. Lewis's wife several shades lighter. Wherever the discussion began, it promptly shaded off toward the color line and insult. Auntie Cord was a Methodist. Lewis was a drunkard. Auntie Cord was ignorant and dogmatic. Lewis could read and was intelligent. Theology invariably led to personality, and eventually to epithets, crockery, geology, and victuals. How the greatest joker of the age did enjoy that summer warfare! The fun was not all one-sided. An incident of that summer probably furnished more enjoyment for the colored members of the household than it did for Mark Twain. Lewis had some fowls, and among them was a particularly pestiferous guinea hen that used to get up at 3 in the morning and go around making the kind of a noise that a guinea hen must like and is willing to get up early to hear. Mark Twain did not care for it. He stood it as long as he could one morning, then crept softly from the house to stop it. It was a clear, bright night. Locating the guinea hen, he slipped up stealthily with a stout stick. The bird was pouring out its heart, tearing the moonlight to tatters. Stealing up close, Clemens made a vicious swing with his bludgeon, but just then the guinea stepped forward a little, and he missed. The stroke and his explosion frightened the fowl, and it started to run. Clemens, with his mind now on the single purpose of revenge, started after it. Around the trees, along the paths, up and down the lawn, through gates and across the garden, out over the fields they raced, pursuer and pursued. The guinea no longer sang, and Clemens was presently too exhausted to swear. Hour after hour the silent, deadly hunt continued, both stopping to rest at intervals. Then up again and away. It was like something in a dream. It was nearly breakfast time when he dragged himself into the house at last, and the guinea was resting and panting under a currant bush. Later in the day Clemens gave orders to Lewis to "kill and eat that guinea hen," which Lewis did. Clemens himself had never eaten a guinea, but some years later in Paris, when the delicious breast of one of those fowls was served him, he remembered and said, "And to think, after chasing that creature all night, John Lewis got to eat him instead of me." The intent in Tom and Huck, or the inspiration for their adventures, gave out at last, or was superseded by a more immediate demand. As early as May, Goodman, in San Francisco, had seen a play announced there, presenting the character of Colonel Sellers, dramatized by Gilbert S. Densmore and played by John T. Raymond. Goodman immediately wrote Clemens. Also a letter came from Warner, in Hartford, who had noticed in San Francisco papers announcements of the play. Of course Clemens would take action immediately. He telegraphed, enjoining the performance. Then began a correspondence with the dramatist and actor. This in time resulted in an amicable arrangement, by which the dramatist agreed to dispose of his version to Clemens. Clemens did not wait for it to arrive, but began immediately a version of his own. Just how much or how little of Densmore's work found its way into the completed play, as presented by Raymond later, cannot be known now. Howells conveys the impression that Clemens had no hand in its authorship beyond the character of Sellers as taken from the book. But in a letter still extant, which Clemens wrote to Howells at the time, he says: I worked a month on my play and launched it in New York last Wednesday. I believe it will go. The newspapers have been complimentary. It is simply a setting for one character, Colonel Sellers. As a play, I guess it will not bear critical assault in force. The Warners are as charming as ever. They go shortly to the devil for a year, that is, to Egypt. Raymond, in a letter which he wrote to the Sun, November 3, 1874, declared that not one line of Densmore's dramatization was used, except that which was taken bodily from the Gilded Age. During the newspaper discussion of the matter, Clemens himself prepared a letter for the Hartford Post. This letter was suppressed, but it still exists. In it he says: I entirely rewrote the play 3 separate and distinct times. I had expected to use little of his Densmore's language, and but little of his plot. I do not think there are now 20 sentences of Mr. Densmore's in the play, but I used so much of his plot that I wrote and told him that I should pay him about as much more as I had already paid him in case the play proved a success. I shall keep my word. This letter, written while the matter was fresh in his mind, is undoubtedly in accordance with the facts. That Densmore was fully satisfied may be gathered from an acknowledgment in which he says: Your letter reached me on the ad. With check. In this place permit me to thank you for the very handsome manner in which you have acted in this matter. Warner, meantime, realizing that the play was constructed almost entirely of the Mark Twain chapters of the book, agreed that his collaborator should undertake the work and financial responsibilities of the dramatic venture and reap such rewards as might result. Various stories have been told of this matter, most of them untrue. There was no bitterness between the friends, no semblance of an estrangement of any sort. Warner very generously and promptly admitted that he was not concerned with the play, its authorship, or its profits, whatever the latter might amount to. Moreover, Warner was going to Egypt very soon, and his labors and responsibilities were doubly sufficient as they stood. Clemens's estimate of the play as a dramatic composition was correct enough, but the public liked it, and it was a financial success from the start. He employed a representative to travel with Raymond, to assist in the management and in the division of spoil. The agent had instructions to mail a card every day stating the amount of his share in the profits. Howells once arrived in Hartford just when this postal tide of fortune was at its flood. $150, $200, $300 were the gay figures which they bore, and which he flaunted in the air before he sat down at the table, or rose from it to brandish, and then, flinging his napkin in the chair, walked up and down to exult in. Once, in later years, referring to the matter, Howells said: "He was never a man who cared anything about money except as a dream, and he wanted more and more of it to fill out the spaces of this dream." Which was a true word. Mark Twain with money was like a child with a heap of bright pebbles, ready to pile up more and still more, then presently to throw them all away and begin gathering anew. End of Chapter 95. An Atlantic story and a play. Read by John Greenman. This is section 96 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 96. The New Home. The Clemenses returned to Hartford to find their new house ready, though still full of workmen, decorators, plumbers, and such other minions of labor as make life miserable to those with ambitions for new or improved habitations. The carpenters were still on the lower floor, but the family moved in and camped about in rooms upstairs that were more or less free from the invader. They had stopped in New York 10 days to buy carpets and furnishings, and these began to arrive, with no particular place to put them. But the owners were excited and happy with it all, for it was the pleasant season of the year, and all the new features of the house were fascinating, while the daily progress of the decorators furnished a fresh surprise when they roamed through the rooms at evening. Mrs. Clemens wrote home: "We are perfectly delighted with everything here, and do so want you all to see it." Her husband, as he was likely to do, picked up the letter and finished it. "Livy appoints me to finish this. But how can a headless man perform an intelligent function? I have been bully-ragged all day by the builder, by his foreman, by the architect, by the tapestry devil who is to upholster the furniture, by the idiot who is putting down the carpets, by the scoundrel who is setting up the billiard table, and has left the balls in New York, by the wildcat who is sodding the ground and finishing the driveway after the sun went down, by a book agent whose body is in the back yard and the coroner notified. Just think of this thing going on the whole day long, and I, a man who loathes details with all his heart. But I haven't lost my temper, and I've made Livy lie down most of the time. Could anybody make her lie down all the time?" Warner wrote from Egypt expressing sympathy for their unfurnished state of affairs, but added, "I would rather fit out 3 houses and fill them with furniture than to fit out one dahabeah." Warner was at that moment undertaking his charmingly remembered trip up the Nile. The new home was not entirely done for a long time. One never knows when a big house like that, or a little house for that matter, is done. But they were settled at last, with all their beautiful things in place, and perhaps there have been richer homes, possibly more artistic ones, but there has never been a more charming home, within or without, than that one. So many frequenters have tried to express the charm of that household, none of them has quite succeeded, for it lay not so much in its arrangement of rooms, or their decorations, or their outlook, though these were all beautiful enough, but rather in the personality, the atmosphere, and these are elusive things to convey in words. We can only see and feel and recognize, we cannot translate them. Even Howells, with his subtle touch, can present only an aspect here and there, an essence, as it were, from a happy garden, rather than the fullness of its bloom. As Mark Twain was unlike any other man that ever lived, so his house was unlike any other house ever built. People asked him why he built the kitchen toward the street, and he said, "So the servants can see the circus go by without running out into the front yard." But this was probably an afterthought. The kitchen end of the house extended toward Farmington Avenue, but it was by no means unbeautiful. It was a pleasing detail of the general scheme. The main entrance faced at right angles with the street and opened to a spacious hall. In turn, the hall opened to a parlor, where there was a grand piano, and to the dining room and library, and the library opened to a little conservatory, semicircular in form, of a design invented by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Says Howells: "The plants were set in the ground, and the flowering vines climbed up the sides and overhung the roof above the silent spray of the fountain, accompanied by callas and other water-loving lilies. There, while we breakfast, Patrick came in from the barn and sprinkled the pretty bower, which poured out its responsive perfume in the delicate accents of its varied blossoms. In the library was an old carved mantel which Clemens and his wife had bought in Scotland, salvage from a dismantled castle, and across the top of the fireplace a plate of brass with the motto, "The ornament of a house is the friends that frequent it," surely never more appropriately inscribed. There was the mahogany room, a large bedroom on the ground floor, and upstairs were other spacious bedrooms and many baths, while everywhere were Oriental rugs and draperies and statuary and paintings. There was a fireplace under a window, after the English pattern, so that in winter time one could at the same moment watch the blaze and the falling snow. The library windows looked out over the valley with the little stream in it, and through and across the tree tops. At the top of the house was what became Clemens's favorite retreat, the billiard room, and here and there were unexpected little balconies, which one could step out upon for the view. Below was a wide covered veranda, the ombra, as they called it, secluded from the public eye, a favorite family gathering place on pleasant days. But a house might easily have all these things without being more than usually attractive, and a house with a great deal less might have been as full of charm. Only it seemed just the proper setting for that particular household, and undoubtedly it acquired the personality of its occupants. Howells assures us that there never was another home like it, and we may accept his statement. It was unique. It was the home of one of the most unusual and unaccountable personalities in the world, yet was perfectly and serenely ordered. Mark Twain was not responsible for this blissful condition. He was its beacon light. It was around Mrs. Clemens that its affairs steadily revolved. If in the 4 years and more of marriage Clemens had made advancement in culture and capabilities, Olivia Clemens also had become something more than the half-timid, inexperienced girl he had first known. In a way, her education had been no less notable than his. She had worked and studied, and her half-year of travel and entertainment abroad had given her opportunity for acquiring knowledge and confidence. Her vision of life had vastly enlarged, her intellect had flowered, her grasp of practicalities had become firm and sure. In spite of her delicate physical structure, her continued uncertainty of health, she capably undertook the management of their large new house, and supervised its economies. Any one of her undertakings was sufficient for one woman, but she compassed them all. No children had more careful direction than hers, no husband had more devoted attendance and companionship, no household was ever directed with a sweeter and gentler grace, or with greater perfection of detail. When the great ones of the world came to visit America's most picturesque literary figure, she gave welcome to them all, and filled her place at his side with such sweet and capable dignity that those who came to pay their duties to him often returned to pay even greater devotion to his companion. Says Howells, "She was, in a way, the loveliest person I have ever seen, the gentlest, the kindest, without a touch of weakness. She united wonderful tact with wonderful truth, and Clemens not only accepted her rule implicitly, but he rejoiced, he gloried in it." And once, in an interview with the writer of these chapters, Howells declared, "She was not only a beautiful soul, but a woman of singular intellectual power. I never knew any one quite like her." Then he added, "Words cannot express Mrs. Clemens, her fineness, her delicate, her wonderful tact with a man who was in some respects, and wished to be, the most outrageous creature that ever breathed." Howells meant a good many things by that, no doubt. Clemens's violent methods, for one thing, his sudden, savage impulses, which sometimes worked injustice and hardship for others, though he was first to discover the wrong and to repair it only too fully. Then, too, Howells may have meant his boyish teasing tendency to disturb Mrs. Clemens's exquisite sense of decorum. Once I remember seeing him come into the drawing room at Hartford in a pair of white cowskin slippers with the hair out, and do a crippled colored uncle, to the joy of all beholders. I must not say all, for I remember also the dismay of Mrs. Clemens and her low, despairing cry of "Oh, youth!" He was continually doing such things as the crippled colored uncle, partly for the very joy of the performance, but partly, too, to disturb her serenity, to incur her reproof, to shiver a little shock would be too strong a word. And he liked to fancy her in a spirit and attitude of belligerence, to present that fancy to those who knew the measure of her gentle nature. Writing to Mrs. Howells of a picture of herself in a group, he said: "You look exactly as Mrs. Clemens does after she has said, 'Indeed, I do not wonder that you can frame no reply, for you know only too well that your conduct admits of no excuse, palliation, or argument none.'" Clemens would pretend to a visitor that she had been violently indignant over some offense of his. Perhaps he would say, "Well, I contradicted her just now, and the crockery will begin to fly pretty soon." She could never quite get used to this pleasantry, and a faint glow would steal over her face. He liked to produce that glow, yet always his manner toward her was tenderness itself. He regarded her as some dainty bit of porcelain, and it was said that he was always following her about with a chair. Their union has been regarded as ideal. That is Twichell's opinion, and Howells's. The latter sums up: "Marriages are what the parties to them alone really know them to be, but from the outside I should say that this marriage was one of the most perfect." End of Chapter 96. The New Home. Read by John Greenman. This is section 97 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 97. The Walk to Boston. The new home became more beautiful to them as things found their places, as the year deepened, and the wonder of autumn foliage lit up their landscape. Sitting on one side of the little upper balconies, Mrs. Clemens wrote: "The atmosphere is very hazy, and it makes the autumn tints even more soft and beautiful than usual. Mr. Twichell came for Mr. Clemens to go walking with him. They returned at dinner time, heavily laden with autumn leaves." And as usual Clemens, finding the letter unfinished, took up the story. "Twichell came up here with me to luncheon after services, and I went back home with him and took Susy along in her little carriage. We have just got home again, middle of afternoon, and Livy has gone to rest and left the west balcony to me. There is a shining and most marvelous miracle of cloud effects mirrored in the brook, a picture which began with perfection and has momently surpassed it ever since, until at last it is almost unendurably beautiful. There is a cloud picture in the stream now whose hues are as manifold as those in an opal, and as delicate as the tintings of a sea shell. But now a muskrat is swimming through it, and obliterating it with the turmoil of wavelets he casts abroad from his shoulders. The customary Sunday assemblage of strangers is gathered together in the grounds, discussing the house." Twichell and Clemens took a good many walks these days, long walks, for Twichell was an athlete and Clemens had not then outgrown the Nevada habit of pedestrian wandering. Talcott's Tower, a wooden structure about 5 miles from Hartford, was one of their favorite objective points, and often they walked out and back, talking so continuously and so absorbed in the themes of their discussions that time and distance slipped away almost unnoticed. How many things they talked of in those long walks! They discussed philosophies and religions and creeds, and all the range of human possibility and shortcoming, and all the phases of literature and history and politics. Unorthodox discussions they were, illuminating, marvelously enchanting, and vanished now forever. Sometimes they took the train as far as Bloomfield, a little station on the way, and walked the rest of the distance, or they took the train from Bloomfield home. It seems a strange association, perhaps, the fellowship of that violent dissenter with that fervent soul dedicated to church and creed, but the root of their friendship lay in the frankness with which each man delivered his dogmas and respected those of his companion. It was during one of their walks to the Tower that they planned a far more extraordinary undertaking, nothing less, in fact, than a walk from Hartford to Boston. This was early in November. They did not delay the matter, for the weather was getting too uncertain. Clemens wrote Redpath: Dear Redpath, Reverend J. H. Twichell and I expect to start at 8 o'clock Thursday morning to walk to Boston in 24 hours or more. We shall telegraph Young's Hotel for rooms Saturday night, in order to allow for a low average of pedestrianism. It was half past 8 on Thursday morning on November 12, 1874, that they left Twichell's house in a carriage, drove to the East Hartford Bridge, and there took to the road, Twichell carrying a little bag and Clemens a basket of lunch. The papers had got hold of it by this time, and were watching the result. They did well enough that first day, following the old Boston stage road, arriving at Westford about 7 o'clock in the evening, 28 miles from the starting point. There was no real hotel at Westford, only a sort of tavern, but it afforded the luxury of rest. Also, said Twichell, in a memoranda of the trip, a sublimely profane hostler whom you couldn't jostle with any sort of mild remark without bringing down upon yourself a perfect avalanche of oaths. This was a joy to Clemens, who sat behind the stove, rubbing his lame knees and fairly reveling in Twichell's discomfiture in his efforts to divert the hostler's blasphemy. There was also a mellow inebriate there who recommended kerosene for Clemens's lameness, and offered as testimony the fact that he himself had frequently used it for stiffness in his joints after lying out all night in the cold weather, drunk. Altogether it was a notable evening. Westford was about as far as they continued the journey afoot. Clemens was exceedingly lame next morning, and had had a rather bad night. But he swore and limped along 6 miles farther, to North Ashford, then gave it up. They drove from North Ashford to the railway, where Clemens telegraphed Redpath and Howells of their approach. To Redpath: We have made 35 miles in less than 5 days. This demonstrates that the thing can be done. Shall now finish by rail. Did you have any bets on us? To Howells: Arrive by rail at 7 o'clock, the first of a series of grand annual pedestrian tours from Hartford to Boston, to be performed by us. The next will take place next year. Redpath read his dispatch to a lecture audience with effect. Howells made immediate preparation for receiving two wayworn, hungry men. He telegraphed to Young's Hotel: You and Twichell come right up to 37 Concord Avenue, Cambridge, near Observatory. Party waiting for you. They got to Howells about 9 o'clock, and the refreshments were waiting. Miss Longfellow was there, Rose Hawthorne, John Fiske. Larkin G. Mead, the sculptor, and others of their kind. Howells tells in his book how Clemens, with Twichell, suddenly stormed in and immediately began to eat and drink. "I can see him now as he stood up in the midst of our friends, with his head thrown back, and in his hand a dish of those escalloped oysters without which no party in Cambridge was really a party, exulting in the tale of his adventure, which had abounded in the most original characters and amusing incidents at every mile of their progress." Clemens gave a dinner next night to Howells, Aldrich, Osgood, and the rest. The papers were full of jokes concerning the Boston expedition. Some even had illustrations, and it was all amusing enough at the time. Next morning, sitting in the writing room of Young's Hotel, he wrote a curious letter to Mrs. Clemens, though intended as much for Howells and Aldrich as for her. It was dated 61 years ahead, and was a sort of looking backwards, though that notable book had not yet been written. It presupposed a monarchy in which the name of Boston has been changed to Limerick, and Hartford to Dublin. In it Twichell has become the Archbishop of Dublin, Howells Duke of Cambridge, Aldrich Marquis of Ponkapog, Clemens the Earl of Hartford. It was too whimsical and delightful a fancy to be forgotten. This remarkable and amusing document will be found under Appendix M at the end of last volume. A long time afterward, 34 years, he came across this letter. He said: "It seems curious now that I should have been dreaming dreams of a future monarchy and never suspect that the monarchy was already present and the republic a thing of the past." What he meant was the political succession that had fostered those commercial trusts which, in turn, had established party dominion. To Howells, on his return, Clemens wrote his acknowledgments, and added: "Mrs. Clemens gets upon the verge of swearing, and goes tearing around in an unseemly fury when I enlarge upon the delightful time we had in Boston, and she not there to have her share. I have tried hard to reproduce Mrs. Howells to her, and have probably not made a shining success of it." End of Chapter 97. The Walk to Boston. Read by John Greenman. This is section 98 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 98. Old Times on the Mississippi. Howells had been urging Clemens to do something more for the Atlantic, specifically something for the January number. Clemens cudgeled his brains, but finally declared he must give it up. "Mrs. Clemens has diligently persecuted me day by day with urgings to go to work and do that something, but it's no use. I find I can't. We are in such a state of worry and endless confusion that my head won't go." 2 hours later he sent another hasty line: "I take back the remark that I can't write for the January number, for Twichell and I have had a long walk in the woods, and I got to telling him about old Mississippi days of steamboating glory and grandeur as I saw them during 4 years from the pilot house. He said what a virgin subject to hurl into a magazine. I hadn't thought of that before. Would you like a series of papers to run through 3 months, or 6, or 9, or about 4 months, say?" Howells welcomed this offer as an echo of his own thought. He had come from a piloting family himself, and knew the interest that Mark Twain could put into such a series. Acting promptly under the new inspiration, Clemens forthwith sent the first chapter of that monumental, that absolutely unique, series of papers on Mississippi River life, which today constitutes one of his chief claims to immortality. His first number was in the nature of an experiment. Perhaps, after all, the idea would not suit the Atlantic readers. Cut it, scarify it, reject it, handle it with entire freedom, he wrote, and awaited the result. The result was that Howells expressed his delight. The piece about the Mississippi is capital. It almost made the water in our ice pitcher muddy as I read it. I don't think I shall meddle much with it, even in the way of suggestion. The sketch of the low-lived little town was so good that I could have wished there was more of it. I want the sketches, if you can make them every month. Mark Twain was now really interested in this new literary venture. He was fairly saturated with memories. He was writing on the theme that lay nearest to his heart. Within 10 days he reported that he had finished 3 of the papers, and had begun the 4th. And yet I have spoken of nothing but piloting as a science so far, and I doubt if I ever get beyond that portion of my subject. And I don't care to. Any Muggins can write about old days on the Mississippi of 500 different kinds, but I am the only man alive that can scribble about the piloting of that day, and no man has ever tried to scribble about it yet. Its newness pleases me all the time, and it is about the only new subject I know of. He became so enthusiastic presently that he wanted to take Howells with him on a trip down the Mississippi, with their wives for company, to go over the old ground again and obtain added material enough for a book. Howells was willing enough, agreed to go, in fact, but found it hard to get away. He began to temporize and finally backed out. Clemens tried to inveigle Osgood into the trip, but without success; also John Hay. But Hay had a new baby at his house just then, "3 days old, and with a voice beyond price," he said, offering it as an excuse for non-acceptance. So the plan for revisiting the river and the conclusion of the book were held in abeyance for nearly 7 years. Those early piloting chapters, as they appeared in the Atlantic, constituted Mark Twain's best literary exhibit up to that time. In some respects they are his best literature of any time. As pictures of an intensely interesting phase of life, they are so convincing, so real, and at the same time of such extraordinary charm and interest, that if the English language should survive 1,000 years, or 10 times as long, they would be as fresh and vivid at the end of that period as the day they were penned. In them the atmosphere of the river and its environment, its pictures, its 1,000 aspects of life, are reproduced with what is no less than literary necromancy. Not only does he make you smell the river, you can fairly hear it breathe. On the appearance of the first number John Hay wrote: "It is perfect, no more, no less. I don't see how you do it," and added, "You know what my opinion is of time not spent with you." Howells wrote: "You are doing the science of piloting splendidly, every word interesting, and don't you drop the series till you've got every bit of anecdote and reminiscence into it." He let Clemens write the articles to suit himself. Once he said: "If I might put in my jaw at this point, I should say, stick to actual fact and character in the thing, and give things in detail. All that belongs to the old river life is novel, and is now mostly historical. Don't write at any supposed Atlantic audience, but yarn it off as if into my sympathetic ear." Clemens replied that he had no dread of the Atlantic audience. He declared it was the only audience that did not require a humorist to paint himself striped and stand on his head to amuse it. The Old Times papers ran through 7 numbers of the Atlantic. They were reprinted everywhere by the newspapers, who in that day had little respect for magazine copyrights, and were promptly pirated in book form in Canada. They added vastly to Mark Twain's literary capital, though Howells informs us that the Atlantic circulation did not thrive proportionately, for the reason that the newspapers gave the articles to their readers from advanced sheets of the magazine even before the latter could be placed on sale. It so happened that in the January Atlantic, which contained the first of the Mississippi papers, there appeared Robert Dale Owens' article on spiritualism, which brought such humility both to author and publisher because of the exposure of the medium Katy King, which came along while the magazine was in press. Clemens has written this marginal note on the opening page of the copy at Quarry Farm: "While this number of the Atlantic was being printed, the Katy King manifestations were discovered to be the cheapest, wretchedest shams and frauds, and were exposed in the newspapers. The awful humiliation of it unseated Robert Dale Owens' reason, and he died in the madhouse." End of Chapter 98. Old Times on the Mississippi. Read by John Greenman. This is section 99 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 99. A Typewriter and a Joke on Aldrich. It was during the trip to Boston with Twichell that Mark Twain saw for the first time what was then a brand new invention, a typewriter, or it may have been during a subsequent visit a week or two later. At all events, he had the machine and was practicing on it December 9, 1874, for he wrote 2 letters on it that day, one to Howells and the other to Orion Clemens. In the latter he says, "I am trying to get the hang of this new-fangled writing machine, but am not making a shining success of it. However, this is the first attempt I have ever made, and yet I perceive that I shall soon easily acquire a fine facility in its use. I saw the thing in Boston the other day and was greatly taken with it." He goes on to explain the new wonder, and on the whole his first attempt is a very creditable performance. With his usual enthusiasm over an innovation, he believes it is going to be a great help to him, and proclaims its advantages. This is the letter to Howells, with the errors preserved. "You needn't answer this. I am only practicing to get 3 anoth slip up there, only practicing to get the hang of the thing. I notice I misfire and get in a good many unnecessary letters and punctuation marks. I am simply using you for a target to bang at. Blame my cats, but this thing requires genius in order to work it just right." In an article written long after, he tells how he was with Nasby when he first saw the machine in Boston through a window, and how they went in to see it perform. In the same article he states that he was the first person in the world to apply the type machine to literature, and that he thinks the story of Tom Sawyer was the first type-copied manuscript. Tom Sawyer was not then complete, and had been laid aside. The first type-copied manuscript was probably early chapters of the Mississippi story, 2 discarded typewritten pages of which still exist. The new enthusiasm ran its course and died. 3 months later, when the Remington makers wrote him for a recommendation of the machine, he replied that he had entirely stopped using it. The typewriter was not perfect in those days, and the keys did not always respond readily. He declared it was ruining his morals, that it made him want to swear. He offered it to Howells because he said Howells had no morals anyway. Howells hesitated, so Clemens traded the machine to Bliss for a side saddle. But perhaps Bliss also became afraid of its influence, for in due time he brought it back. Howells again tempted, hesitated, and this time was lost. What eventually became of the machine is not history. One of those happy Atlantic dinners which Howells tells of came about the end of that year. It was at the Parker House, and Emerson was there, and Aldrich, and the rest of that group. "Don't you dare to refuse the invitation," said Howells, and naturally Clemens didn't, and wrote back, "I want you to ask Mrs. Howells to let you stay all night at the Parker House and tell lies, and have an improving time, and take breakfast with me in the morning. I will have a good room for you and a fire. Can't you tell her it always makes you sick to go home late at night, or something like that? That sort of thing arouses Mrs. Clemens's sympathies easily." Two memories of that old dinner remain today. Aldrich and Howells were not satisfied with the kind of neckties that Mark Twain wore, the old-fashioned black string tie, a Western survival. So they made him a present of 2 cravats when he set out on his return for Hartford. Next day he wrote: "You and Aldrich have made one woman deeply and sincerely grateful, Mrs. Clemens. For months, I may even say years, she has shown an unaccountable animosity toward my necktie, even getting up in the night to take it with the tongs and blackguard it, sometimes also getting so far as to threaten it. When I said you and Aldrich had given me 2 new neckties, and that they were in a paper in my overcoat pocket, she was in a fever of happiness until she found I was going to frame them. Then all the venom in her nature gathered itself together, insomuch that I, being near to a door, went without, perceiving danger." It is recorded that eventually he wore the neckties, and returned no more to the earlier mode. Another memory of that dinner is linked to a demand that Aldrich made of Clemens that night for his photograph. Clemens, returning to Hartford, put up 52 different specimens in as many envelopes, with the idea of sending one a week for a year. Then he concluded that this was too slow a process, and for a week sent one every morning to "His Grace of Ponkapog." Aldrich stood it for a few days, then protested. "The police," he said, "are in the habit of swooping down upon a publication of that sort." On New Year's no less than 20 pictures came at once, photographs and prints of Mark Twain, his house, his family, his various belongings. Aldrich sent a warning then that the perpetrator of this outrage was known to the police as Mark Twain, alias the Jumping Frog, a well-known California desperado, who would be speedily arrested and brought to Ponkapog to face his victim. This letter was signed T. Bailey, Chief of Police, and on the outside of the envelope there was a statement that it would be useless for that person to send any more mail matter, as the post office had been blown up. The jolly farce closed there. It was the sort of thing that both men enjoyed. Aldrich was writing a story at this time which contained some Western mining incident and environment. He sent the manuscript to Clemens for expert consideration and advice. Clemens wrote him at great length and in careful detail. He was fond of Aldrich, regarding him as one of the most brilliant of men. Once, to Robert Louis Stevenson, he said: "Aldrich has never had his peer for prompt and pithy and witty and humorous sayings. None has equaled him. Certainly none has surpassed him in the felicity of phrasing with which he clothed these children of his fancy. Aldrich is always brilliant. He can't help it. He is a fire opal set round with rose diamonds. When he is not speaking, you know that his dainty fancies are twinkling and glimmering around in him. When he speaks, the diamonds flash. Yes, he is always brilliant. He will always be brilliant. He will be brilliant in hell. You will see. Stevenson, smiling a chuckly smile, said, "I hope not." Well, you will, and he will dim even those ruddy fires and look like a transfigured Adonis backed against a pink sunset. North American Review, September, 1906. End of Chapter 99. A Typewriter and a Joke on Aldrich. Read by John Greenman. This is section 100 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 100. Raymond, Mental Telegraphy, etc. The Sellers play was given in Hartford in January 1875 to as many people as could crowd into the Opera House. Raymond had reached the perfection of his art by that time, and the townsmen of Mark Twain saw the play and the actor at their best. Kate Field played the part of Laura Hawkins, and there was a Hartford girl in the company. Also a Hartford young man, who would one day be about as well known to playgoers as any playwright or actor that America has produced. His name was William Gillette, and it was largely due to Mark Twain that the author of Secret Service and of the dramatic Sherlock Holmes got a fair public start. Clemens and his wife loaned Gillette the $3,000 which tided him through his period of dramatic education. Their faith in his ability was justified. Hartford would naturally be enthusiastic on a first Sellers Raymond night. At the end of the fourth act there was an urgent demand for the author of the play, who was supposed to be present. He was not there in person, but had sent a letter, which Raymond read. My dear Raymond, I am aware that you are going to be welcomed to our town by great audiences on both nights of your stay there, and I beg to add my hearty welcome also through this note. I cannot come to the theater on either evening, Raymond, because there is something so touching about your acting that I can't stand it. I do not mention a couple of colds in my head because I hardly minded them as much as I would the erysipelas, but between you and me I would prefer it if they were rights and lefts. And then there is another thing. I have always taken a pride in earning my living in outside places and spending it in Hartford. I have said that no good citizen would live on his own people, but go forth and make it sultry for other communities and fetch home the result. And now, at this late day, I find myself in the crushed and bleeding position of fattening myself upon the spoils of my brethren. Can I support such grief as this? This is literary emotion, you understand. Take the money at the door just the same. Once more I welcome you to Hartford, Raymond, but as for me, let me stay at home and blush. Yours truly, Mark. The play was equally successful wherever it went. It made what in that day was regarded as a fortune. $100,000 is hardly too large an estimate of the amount divided between author and actor. Raymond was a great actor in that part, as he interpreted it, though he did not interpret it fully, or always in its best way. The finer side, the subtle, tender side of Colonel Sellers, he was likely to overlook. Yet, with the natural human self estimate, Raymond believed he had created a much greater part than Mark Twain had written. Doubtless, from the point of view of a number of people, this was so, though the idea was naturally obnoxious to Clemens. In course of time their personal relations ceased. Clemens that winter gave another benefit for Father Hawley. In reply to an invitation to appear in behalf of the poor, he wrote that he had quit the lecture field, and would not return to the platform unless driven there by lack of bread, but he added: "By the spirit of that remark I am debarred from delivering this proposed lecture, and so I fall back upon the letter of it, and emerge upon the platform for this last and final time, because I am confronted by a lack of bread among Father Hawley's flock." He made an introductory speech at an old fashioned spelling bee given at the Asylum Hill Church, a breezy, charming talk of which the following is a sample: "I don't see any use in spelling a word right, and never did. I mean, I don't see any use in having a uniform and arbitrary way of spelling words. We might as well make all clothes alike and cook all dishes alike. Sameness is tiresome. Variety is pleasing. I have a correspondent whose letters are always a refreshment to me. There is such a breezy, unfettered originality about his orthography. He always spells cow with a large K. Now that is just as good as to spell it with a small one. It is better. It gives the imagination a broader field, a wider scope. It suggests to the mind a grand, vague, impressive, new kind of a cow." He took part in the contest, and in spite of his early reputation was spelled down on the word cauldron, which he spelled Cauldron, as he had been taught, while the dictionary used as authority gave that form as second choice. Another time that winter Clemens read before the Monday Evening Club a paper on universal suffrage, which is still remembered by the surviving members of that time. A paragraph or two will convey its purport: "Our marvelous latter day statesmanship has invented universal suffrage. That is the finest feather in our cap. All that we require of a voter is that he shall be forked, wear pantaloons instead of petticoats, and bear a more or less humorous resemblance to the reported image of God. He need not know anything whatever. He may be wholly useless and a cumberer of the earth. He may even be known to be a consummate scoundrel. No matter. While he can steer clear of the penitentiary his vote is as weighty as the vote of a president, a bishop, a college professor, a merchant prince. We brag of our universal, unrestricted suffrage, but we are shams after all, for we restrict when we come to the women." The Monday Evening Club was an organization which included the best minds of Hartford. Dr. Horace Bushnell, Professor Calvin E. Stowe, and J. Hammond Trumbull founded it back in the 60s, and it included such men as Reverend Dr. Parker, Reverend Dr. Burton, Charles H. Clark of the Courant, Warner and Twichell, with others of their kind. Clemens had been elected after his first sojourn in England, February 1873, and had then read a paper on the "License of the Press." The club met alternate Mondays from October to May. There was one paper for each evening, and after the usual fashion of such clubs, the reading was followed by discussion. Members of that time agree that Mark Twain's association with the club had a tendency to give it a life, or at least an exhilaration, which it had not previously known. His papers were serious in their purpose. He always preferred to be serious, but they evidenced the magic gift which made whatever he touched turn to literary jewelry. Psychic theories and phenomena always attracted Mark Twain. In thought transference especially he had a frank interest, an interest awakened and kept alive by certain phenomena psychic manifestations we call them now. In his association with Mrs. Clemens it not infrequently happened that one spoke the other's thought, or perhaps a long procrastinated letter to a friend would bring an answer as quickly as mailed. But these are things familiar to us all. A more startling example of thought communication developed at the time of which we are writing, an example which raised to a fever point whatever interest he may have had in the subject before. He was always having these vehement interests, rages we may call them, for it would be inadequate to speak of them as fads, inasmuch as they tended in the direction of human enlightenment, or progress, or reform. Clemens one morning was lying in bed when, as he says, "suddenly a red-hot new idea came whistling down into my camp." The idea was that the time was ripe for a book that would tell the story of the Comstock, of the Nevada silver mines. It seemed to him that the person best qualified for the work was his old friend William Wright, Dan de Quille. He had not heard from Dan or of him for a long time, but decided to write and urge him to take up the idea. He prepared the letter, going fully into the details of his plan, as was natural for him to do, then laid it aside until he could see Bliss and secure his approval of the scheme from a publishing standpoint. Just a week later, it was the 9th of March, a letter came, a thick letter, bearing a Nevada postmark, and addressed in a handwriting which he presently recognized as de Quille's. To a visitor who was present he said, "Now I will do a miracle. I will tell you everything this letter contains, date, signature, and all without breaking the seal." He stated what he believed was in the letter. Then he opened it and showed that he had correctly given its contents, which were the same in all essential details as those of his own letter not yet mailed. In an article on mental telegraphy he invented the name he relates this instance, with others, and in Following the Equator, and elsewhere, he records other such happenings. It was one of the mysteries in which he never lost interest, though his concern in it in time became a passive one. The result of the de Quille manifestation, however, he has not recorded. Clemens immediately wrote, urging Dan to come to Hartford for an extended visit. De Quille came, and put in a happy spring in his old comrade's luxurious home, writing "The Big Bonanza," which Bliss successfully published a year later. Mark Twain was continually inviting old friends to share his success with him. Any comrade of former days found welcome in his home as often as he would come, and for as long as he would stay. Clemens dropped his own affairs to advise in their undertakings, and if their undertakings were literary he found them a publisher. He did this for Joaquin Miller and for Bret Harte, and he was always urging Goodman to make his house a home. The Beecher Tilton trial was the sensation of the spring of 1875, and Clemens, in common with many others, was greatly worked up over it. The printed testimony had left him decidedly in doubt as to Beecher's innocence, though his blame would seem to have been less for the possible offense than because of the great leader's attitude in the matter. To Twichell he said: "His quibbling was fatal. Innocent or guilty, he should have made an unqualified statement in the beginning." Together they attended one of the sessions, on a day when Beecher himself was on the witness stand. The tension was very great. The excitement was painful. Twichell thought that Beecher appeared well under the stress of examination, and was deeply sorry for him. Clemens was far from convinced. The feeling was especially strong in Hartford, where Henry Ward Beecher's relatives were prominent, and animosities grew out of it. They are all forgotten now. Most of those who cherished bitterness are dead. Any feeling that Clemens had in the matter lasted but a little while. Howells tells us that when he met him some months after the trial ended, and was tempted to mention it, Clemens discouraged any discussion of the event. Says Howells: "He would only say the man had suffered enough, as if the man had expiated his wrong, and he was not going to do anything to renew his penalty. I found that very curious, very delicate. His continued blame would not come to the sufferer's knowledge, but he felt it his duty to forbear it." It was 100 years, that 19th of April, since the battles of Lexington and Concord, and there was to be a great celebration. The Howellses had visited Hartford in March, and the Clemenses were invited to Cambridge for the celebration. Only Clemens could go, which in the event proved a good thing perhaps, for when Clemens and Howells set out for Concord they did not go over to Boston to take the train, but decided to wait for it at Cambridge. Apparently it did not occur to them that the train would be jammed the moment the doors were opened at the Boston station, but when it came along they saw how hopeless was their chance. They had special invitations and passage from Boston, but these were only mockeries now. It was cold and chilly, and they forlornly set out in search of some sort of a conveyance. They tramped around in the mud and raw wind, but vehicles were either filled or engaged, and drivers and occupants were inclined to jeer at them. Clemens was taken with an acute attack of indigestion, which made him rather dismal and savage. Their effort finally ended with his trying to run down a tally ho which was empty inside and had a party of Harvard students riding atop. The students, who did not recognize their would-be fare, enjoyed the race. They encouraged their pursuer, and perhaps their driver, with merriment and cheers. Clemens was handicapped by having to run in the slippery mud, and soon dropped by the wayside. "I am glad," says Howells, "I cannot recall what he said when he came back to me." They hung about a little longer, then dragged themselves home, slipped into the house, and built up a fine, cheerful fire on the hearth. They proposed to practice a deception on Mrs. Howells by pretending they had been to Concord and returned, but it was no use. Their statements were flimsy, and guilt was plainly written on their faces. Howells recalls this incident delightfully, and expresses the belief that the humor of the situation was finally a greater pleasure to Clemens than the actual visit to Concord would have been. Twichell did not have any such trouble in attending the celebration. He had adventures he was always having adventures but they were of a more successful kind. Clemens heard the tale of them when he returned to Hartford. He wrote it to Howells: "Joe Twichell preached morning and evening here last Sunday. Took midnight train for Boston. Got an early breakfast and started by rail at 7:30 A.M. for Concord. Swelled around there until 1 P.M., seeing everything. Then traveled on top of a train to Lexington. Saw everything there. Traveled on top of a train to Boston, with hundreds in company. deluged with dust, smoke, and cinders, yelled and hurrahed all the way like a schoolboy, lay flat down to dodge numerous bridges, and sailed into the depot howling with excitement and as black as a chimney sweep. Got to Young's Hotel at 7 P.M., sat down in the reading room, and immediately fell asleep. Was promptly awakened by a porter, who supposed he was drunk. Wandered around an hour and a half, then took 9 P.M. train, sat down in a smoking car, and remembered nothing more until awakened by conductor as the train came into Hartford at 1:30 A.M. Thinks he had simply a glorious time, and wouldn't have missed the centennial for the world. He would have run out to see us a moment at Cambridge, but he was too dirty. I wouldn't have wanted him there. His appalling energy would have been an insufferable reproach to mild adventurers like you and me. End of Chapter 100. Raymond, Mental Telegraphy, etc. Read by John Greenman. This is section 101 of Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, A Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 101. Concluding Tom Sawyer. Mark Twain's Editors. Meantime, the inspiration tank, as Clemens sometimes called it, had filled up again. He had received from somewhere new afflatus for the story of Tom and Huck, and was working on it steadily. The family remained in Hartford, and early in July, under full head of steam, he brought the story to a close. On the 5th he wrote Howells: I have finished the story, and didn't take the chap beyond boyhood. I believe it would be fatal to do it in any shape but autobiographically, like Gil Blas. I perhaps made a mistake in not writing it in the first person. If I went on now and took him into manhood, he would just lie like all the one-horse men in literature, and the reader would conceive a hearty contempt for him. It is not a boy's book at all. It will only be read by adults. It is only written for adults. He would like to see the story in the Atlantic, he said, but doubted the wisdom of serialization. By and by I shall take a boy of 12 and run him through life in the first person, but not Tom Sawyer. He would not make a good character for it. From which we get the first glimpse of Huck's later adventures. Of course he wanted Howells to look at the story. It was a tremendous favor to ask, he said, and added, but I know of no other person whose judgment I could venture to take fully and entirely. Don't hesitate to say no, for I know how your time is taxed, and I would have honest need to blush if you said yes. Send on your manuscript, wrote Howells. You've no idea what I may ask you to do for me some day. But Clemens, conscience-stricken, blushed and weakened, as he said. When Howells insisted, he wrote, but I will gladly send it to you if you will do as follows. Dramatize it, if you perceive that you can, and take for your remuneration half of the first $6,000 which I receive for its representation on the stage. You could alter the plot entirely if you chose. I could help in the work most cheerfully after you had arranged the plot. I have my eye upon two young girls who can play Tom and Huck." Howells in his reply urged Clemens to do the playwriting himself. He could never find time, he said, and he doubted whether he could enter into the spirit of another man's story. Clemens did begin a dramatization then or a little later, but it was not completed. Mrs. Clemens, to whom he had read the story as it proceeded, was as anxious as her husband for Howells's opinion, for it was the first extended piece of fiction Mark Twain had undertaken alone. He carried the manuscript over to Boston himself, and whatever their doubts may have been, Howells's subsequent letter set them at rest. He wrote that he had sat up till 1 in the morning to get to the end of it, simply because it was impossible to leave off. "It is altogether the best boy story I ever read. It will be an immense success, but I think you ought to treat it explicitly as a boy's story. Grown-ups will enjoy it just as much if you do, and if you should put it forth as a story of boys' character from the grown-up point of view, you give the wrong key to it." Viewed in the light of later events, there has never been any better literary opinion than that, none that has been more fully justified. Clemens was delighted. He wrote concerning a point here and there, one inquiry referring to the use of a certain strong word. Howells's reply left no doubt. "I'd have that swearing out in an instant. I suppose I didn't notice it because the location was so familiar to my Western sense, and so exactly the thing Huck would say, but it won't do for children." It was in the last chapter where Huck relates to Tom the sorrows of reform, and tells how they comb him "all to thunder." In the original, "They comb me all to hell," says Huck, which statement, one must agree, is more effective, more the thing Huck would be likely to say. Clemens' acknowledgment of the correction was characteristic. "Mrs. Clemens received the mail this morning, and the next minute she lit into the study with danger in her eye and this demand on her tongue: 'Where is the profanity Mr. Howells speaks of?' Then I had to miserably confess that I had left it out when reading the manuscript to her. Nothing but almost inspired lying got me out of this scrape with my scalp. Does your wife give you rats like that when you go a little one-sided?" The Clemens family did not go to Elmira that year. The children's health seemed to require the seashore, and in August they went to Bateman's Point, Rhode Island, where Clemens most of the time played tenpins in an alley that had gone to ruin. The balls would not stay on the track. The pins stood in inebriate angles. It reminded him of the old billiard tables of Western mining camps, and furnished the same uncertainty of play. It was his delight, after he had become accustomed to the eccentricities of the alley, to invite in a stranger and watch his suffering and his frantic effort to score. End of Chapter 101. Concluding Tom Sawyer. Mark Twain's Editors. Read by John Greenman.